Hello and welcome to this online press conference by the National Center on Sexual Exploitation entitled The Freedom from Sexploitation Agenda. The National Center on Sexual Exploitation is a nonprofit in Washington, D.C. dedicated to addressing the harms of all forms of sexual exploitation. Founded in 1962, the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, or NCOSE for short, is entering its 55th year and conducts programs of public education, coalition leadership, and corporate and governmental policy activism. While NCOSE is a nonpartisan organization, we strive under every administration to educate on and advocate for policies that better combat sex trafficking, sexual violence, child sexual exploitation, pornography, and more. Today, America is suffering from a sexual exploitation crisis where all of these forms of sexploitation run rampant. This necessitates that the full spectrum of sexual harm be addressed by our federal government. You can take action by following our link, which will be posted in the comments, to send an email to urge President Trump and Congress to address these issues of sexual exploitation. For those of you who have followed NCOSE in the past, you know that issues of pornography and obscenity law have remained central pillars of our platform. To speak to administrative goals on this issue, I'd like to introduce Patrick Truman, the CEO and President of the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. As President of NCOSE, Patrick Truman spearheads corporate policy activism, leads the Law Center, and guides the Coalition to End Sexual Exploitation. Patrick Truman is a former chief of the Child Exploitation and Obscenity Section Criminal Division at the U.S. Department of Justice from 1988 to 1993. Mr. Truman.
Thank you very much, Haley Halverson. We appreciate your good work as Communications Director. We have several items on our agenda that we're presenting to the Trump administration, and a couple of them involve the issue of pornography. We're going to ask the Surgeon General of the United States, as well as the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, to investigate the public health harms of pornography. We know that pornography, it leads to sexual violence, to addiction, to sexual dysfunction. It aids in the spread of sexually transmitted diseases, and there are many other public health consequences. Yet there hasn't been a buy-in to this from the federal government. The federal government now needs to look at all the public health consequences, because every family in America is harmed in one way or another by pornography. We are 25 years into the internet age where pornography is rampant. The time is now to look into the public health consequences. We're also asking the U.S. Department of Justice to enforce obscenity laws, or the laws prohibiting distribution of hardcore pornography. Most people don't even know, or maybe have forgotten, that federal laws passed by Congress and enforced by the Justice Department over many years and upheld by the United States Supreme Court prohibit the distribution of hardcore pornography, or we call it obscenity, on the internet or on cable and satellite television, in hotels and motels, in retail shops, or by mail, or distribution by common carrier. And we believe these laws should be enforced. Why do we want to enforce federal obscenity laws? Well, there are several reasons. Number one, the law is a great teacher. The Supreme Court itself has said that enforcing obscenity laws help to maintain a standard of decency in society. Also, we would urge that the laws be enforced to establish community standards. The Supreme Court, in outlining what obscenity laws can be enforced, have said we must take into account community standards. But when the U.S. Department of Justice refuses to enforce obscenity laws in your community, then the standard becomes anything goes. And you've seen that with what's available on the internet and in some porn shops and other places in your communities. Obscenity laws, when they are enforced, establish community standards. And the pornographers will not come into your community if you are enforcing these laws. Another reason to enforce the laws is because pornographers will self-regulate if you do enforce them. When I was chief of the Justice Department's prosecution section, and we vigorously enforced these laws, we found that the pornography industry itself put out a list of acts in porn movies that could not be displayed on video. And those acts are quite numerous. They really softened what was available in terms of pornography because the laws were enforced. And also another reason is to stop, of course, the public health crisis of pornography. As I said, every family in America suffers from pornography in one way or another. At least every family should be concerned about the impact of pornography. We are also asking the Federal Communications Commission to enforce indecency law on broadcast television. Congress, many years ago, said that indecent or profane material cannot be displayed on television during certain hours when children might be in the audience. It's a very reasonable law because television should be available for all. TV shouldn't be just for those who want indecent material or profane material. And so we're asking the Federal Communications Commission to enforce indecency law. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Truman. Next, we have Lisa Thompson, Vice President and Director of Education and Outreach at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. Lisa joins NCOSE following nearly 2 years' work with World Hope International as its Director of Anti-Trafficking and nearly 12 years as liaison for the abolition of sexual trafficking for the Salvation Army American National Headquarters. Given her in-depth knowledge of these issues, she will speak to policy recommendations specifically regarding commercial sexual exploitation, both sex trafficking and prostitution. Lisa?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to just be addressing 3 topics. We have several more outlined in a letter that we have presented to members of the Trump administration. But in the light of time, we want to just highlight 3 particular issues that we think are of importance to that could be dealt on right away by this administration. Now, one of the low-hanging fruit things that the administration could do would be to nominate an individual to the position of ambassador at large for trafficking of persons at the U.S. State Department. And we would hope that this person who would be nominated for this ambassadorial position will be someone who's very well versed in matters of sex trafficking and human trafficking in general, but that also will have a specific understanding about the issues of sex trafficking and prostitution. In our work here, we have observed some particular concerns about the trends that are developing in the anti-trafficking movement. And in particular, one of the things that we've noticed is that there's a bias to only deal with the child victims of sex trafficking as opposed to adult victims of sex trafficking. So we're very concerned that women who are exploited and trafficked into the commercial sex industry be given every bit as much level of concern as those who are minors. Additionally, we want to see somebody in this position who's very committed to the fight against the demand for commercial sex. And my remarks in a few minutes will get more into that issue. But we see the position of ambassador at large for trafficking in persons as a very key position in the battle against sexual trafficking and human trafficking in general. And we want to see somebody who's very committed not only to combating labor trafficking, but also sex trafficking, not only of minors, but also of adult women. Additionally, one of the areas where we think is of prime importance to this movement is amending Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Now, in 1996, Congress passed the Communications Decency Act, and it was with the intent of protecting children from internet pornography. Now, unfortunately, much of this law was struck down by the Supreme Court many years ago, but a section called 230 still stands today. Now, interestingly, this section of the law provides large companies, that particularly like internet service providers, with immunity should third parties be posting material that is illegal or criminal on their site because they ostensibly don't have control over what third parties post on their site. Now, even though I think the language is nuanced and is more nuanced and it's been interpreted in the courts, as it exists right now, Section 230 is allowing certain websites whose business model is built on sexual exploitation to operate with complete impunity. They're able to facilitate vast amounts of sex trafficking and sexual exploitation of women, children, men, boys, with complete impunity. There have been numerous attempts to go after them. Many of the U.S. Attorney Generals have even beseeched the U.S. Congress to amend this law so that these people can be brought to justice. But unfortunately, a large conglomeration of tech giants, as well as people that we believe are First Amendment radicals, I don't think there's any other way to put it, have thwarted efforts to amend the CDA. And because of this, entities like Backpage.com, which is a website that's notorious for its role in facilitating sex trafficking not only in the U.S. but around the world, is allowed to flourish despite all kinds of efforts and high level of scrutiny and activism by people all across the country. So to us, in our perspective, there's this is the single biggest obstacle to the efforts to combat sexual exploitation in our country today. So if we're serious about combating sex trafficking and sexual exploitation, amending the CDA is absolutely imperative. And additionally, the third issue I wanted to raise today is the ongoing debate and what I would consider a major push that is underway to fully decriminalize prostitution. Now, why is this relevant? Well, let me back up a little bit. In the fight against human trafficking today, there's a lot of conversation and discussion about the need to examine supply chains. And usually these conversations are restricted to conversations about labor trafficking and how we need to look at the supply chains and find where labor trafficking is being used in the production of all kinds of goods that we consume on a daily basis. Well, at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, we believe that we must not only apply this issue of supply chains to labor trafficking, but also to the discussions about sex trafficking. And when you do this, you quickly find yourself confronted with an examination of the commercial sex industry. So basically the point here is that the context in which sexual exploitation matters. So we're very concerned about the commercial sex industry writ large. Whereas there's a really pithy line that I think is helpful here. Someone once said that to consider sex trafficking without taking into account prostitution is like considering the slave trade without regard to the cotton fields. Of course, nobody today would consider the issue of the African American slave trade without the context of the Deep South, the economy, and the significance of the cotton trade. Well, we think that the commercial sex trade, or what I like to call organized sexual exploitation, is critical if we're going to be successful in our efforts to combat sex trafficking. Now, this gets me to a matter of policy that is actually a raging discussion that's going around across the country and around the world. And this debate has been going on for quite some time, but it's really come back into the fore in the last year, primarily because of a policy position adopted by Amnesty International. Amnesty International last year adopted a policy in which it's calling for the adoption of full decriminalization of prostitution. Now, what this means is that all the parties involved in prostitution transactions become legitimate. They are legitimized. There's no criminal activity involved in whether you're selling sex acts, facilitating the purchase of sex acts, or buying sex acts. Now, at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, we fully believe that in the United States we have broken laws concerning the issue of prostitution. There's much reform that's needed. There's been many miscarriages of justice, and that women in the sex trade have been disproportionately borne the brunt of the criminal justice system. And we're excited about many of the reform efforts that are underway to help these women not suffer the full punitive force of the law and to receive services so that they can exit the sex trade. But what full decriminalization of prostitution does, though, is, and is terribly concerning, is that it basically normalizes activities such as pimping, or what I would call sex trafficking. Now, sex trafficking involves the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provisioning, obtaining of a person for the purposes of a commercial sex act. And this is exactly the types of things that pimps do. We euphemistically would call sex traffickers pimps. And by decriminalizing this behavior, you're saying that it's no longer criminal to participate in the facilitation of bringing together the individual who's selling and the individual who's buying. And moreover, when you fully decriminalize prostitution, you normalize sex buying behavior. So in other words, it morphs the individuals who are paying for the right to sexually exploit someone. It's normalizing this behavior. In a sense, it's acceding to a right for people to buy sex. And we think this is an outrage, and that it normalizes sexual exploitation. So what we are suggesting to the administration is that it direct the Departments of Justice, State, Health and Human Services, as well as USAID to provide guidance to not only the U.S. states, but also foreign governments, whichever is appropriate for the institution I just named, that they advise states and governments against the full decriminalization of prostitution and against the normalization of prostitution as a form of work. At the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, we believe that sexual exploitation is nobody's job, and so we reject this normalization of prostitution as a form of work. So these are three areas in which we think the administration should act swiftly, robustly, and that it can make a really big difference in the fight against sexual exploitation in our country today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. This concludes our presentations for today. While the recommendations that we've presented today cannot possibly address every single policy issue required on these issues, should these recommendations be enacted, the Trump administration would make significant strides towards protecting human dignity and combating sexual exploitation. We hope that everyone, from individuals to families to members of this new administration, can rally around that goal. You can keep up to date on our efforts with the administration at endsexualexploitation.org/freedomagenda. And remember, you can take action by following